Some ancient stories survived not because they were complete, but because most of them disappeared. The Book of Enoch reached us through fragments, copies, and traditions shaped across centuries, while another related text, the Book of Giants, preserves a darker and more uncertain glimpse of the same ancient world. What was remembered, what was lost, and what may have been deliberately left outside the surviving Enoch tradition. The deeper question is this: what did the Dead Sea Scrolls leave out of Enoch? Long before the Dead Sea Scrolls were placed in caves beside the Dead Sea, Jewish writers were already telling stories about a world that seemed larger than the ordinary human world. Heaven and earth were not imagined as completely separate places. Angels could appear in human stories, ancient figures could become symbols of wisdom, and events described in the distant past could be used to think about questions of order, violence, judgment, and the limits of human life. The Book of Enoch belongs to that setting. It did not emerge as a modern book written at one moment by one author. What is now called First Enoch is a collection of writings that grew within the Jewish world of the Second Temple period, and different portions reflect different stages of that literary tradition. That distinction matters because the title can make the work sound more unified than the surviving evidence allows. The name Enoch comes from a figure who appears briefly in Genesis, where he is presented as an ancestor in the generations before the flood. The biblical account gives very little information about him, but later Jewish traditions developed his character much further. Enoch became associated with extraordinary knowledge and with journeys into the heavenly realm. In these later writings, his name provides a voice through which ancient authors could describe a world filled with heavenly beings, cosmic order, judgment, and hidden knowledge. Yet, the historical importance of Enoch is not that historians have discovered evidence that such journeys actually occurred. The importance lies in the fact that people in antiquity preserved and developed these traditions, and that several versions of them survived in different languages and manuscripts. The Dead Sea Scrolls changed our understanding because they showed that parts of the Enochic tradition existed in Aramaic manuscripts long before the complete Ethiopic form became known to modern readers. Among the manuscripts from Qumran are fragments connected with Enochic writings, including material associated with the Book of Giants. Some of these manuscripts were copied during the Second Temple period, while others belong to later periods of copying. Their physical survival is itself a reminder of how fragile ancient literature was. A text could be copied many times, preserved by one community, ignored by another, translated into another language, or simply disappear when the people who valued it were gone. Nothing about that process guarantees that the surviving collection represents everything that once circulated. This is where the story of Enoch begins to become a story about human memory itself. We often imagine ancient history as a long chain in which important writings naturally pass from one generation to another. In reality, preservation depended on ordinary material things: parchment, ink, language, readers, scribes, communities, and circumstances. The earliest human societies faced this same basic problem in a much broader form. Before written records, knowledge about ancestors, landscapes, animals, seasons, and distant places had to move through living memory. Writing changed the method, but not the vulnerability. A written tradition could still become fragmented. The Book of Enoch therefore does not begin with a mysterious missing book waiting somewhere to be uncovered. It begins with a surviving collection surrounded by evidence of other traditions, some preserved only in pieces. And somewhere within that larger world stands the Book of Giants, a related composition whose surviving fragments allow us to glimpse a story that once existed beside the Enochic traditions, while also reminding us how much of the ancient literary landscape has already fallen silent. The silence is important. When a manuscript is missing, we cannot automatically treat the absence as evidence that someone removed it. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the most human one. Texts survive unevenly, and history is shaped by what happened to remain. To understand why Enoch became so important, it helps to step away from the idea of a single ancient book and enter the wider world in which these writings developed. The Jewish communities of the Second Temple period lived across a changing landscape of kingdoms, languages, and religious traditions. The Temple in Jerusalem remained central to Jewish life, while Jewish communities also existed far beyond Judea. Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek were all used in different settings, and written traditions could travel between communities as they were copied, translated, adapted, and preserved. Within this world, older biblical stories could become the starting point for new questions. The brief account of Enoch in Genesis was one such starting point. Genesis says that Enoch lived for an unusual span, that he walked with God, and that he was taken by God rather than simply described as dying in the ordinary way. The passage is short, but later writers found room inside that silence. They developed traditions in which Enoch became a figure associated with heavenly knowledge and the structure of the cosmos. This does not mean that ancient readers all understood Enoch in exactly the same way. Different writings attributed to his name contain different concerns and styles. Some focus on journeys through heavenly realms. Others describe astronomical movements and calendars. Others concentrate on judgment, moral disorder, and the fate of rebellious heavenless beings. The variety is important because it shows that Enoch functioned as a literary figure through whom different communities could explore questions that mattered to them. The stories about heavenly beings were also connected to an older biblical passage in Genesis, where the sons of God appear alongside human women and the Nephilim before the flood. The biblical text itself is brief and leaves many details unexplained. Later Jewish literature expanded that episode into a much larger story, involving heavenly beings, forbidden behavior, human violence, and divine judgment. The Book of Giants belongs to this expanding tradition. It is not simply another copy of Genesis, and it should not be treated as a straightforward historical report about physical beings. It is an ancient religious composition, preserved only in fragments, that uses the story of the giants to think about corruption, dreams, judgment, and the consequences of disorder. This distinction is especially important when discussing the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scrolls do not provide a single secret version of Enoch that suddenly replaces everything known before. Instead, they preserve pieces of a much larger literary environment. Among the manuscripts discovered near Qumran are copies of several works associated with Enochic traditions, demonstrating that such writings circulated in the ancient Jewish world. The fragments also show that the tradition was not frozen. Texts could exist in different forms, and related stories could develop alongside one another. That is why the question of what was left out needs care. An ancient collection that survives incompletely does not automatically reveal an intentional act of removal. Sometimes the missing material was simply lost. Sometimes different communities preferred different writings. Sometimes a text survived in another language or through another branch of transmission. The same basic problem reaches back to the earliest stages of human culture. Long before writing, people depended on memory, repetition, and teaching to carry knowledge between generations. Written tradition gave those memories a more durable form, but every manuscript still depended on someone choosing to copy it and someone else choosing to preserve the copy. Enoch therefore stands at an interesting boundary between memory and literature. A very short biblical reference became the foundation for generations of reflection, and those reflections produced texts that could themselves fragment, travel, and disappear. What remains in the caves is not a complete window into that ancient world, but a collection of quiet traces, enough to show that the story was larger than any single surviving manuscript. The story of the giants does not begin with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it does not begin with the Book of Enoch. Its oldest surviving starting point is much shorter, found in the Book of Genesis in a few enigmatic lines placed just before the account of the flood. The passage speaks of the sons of God, the daughters of humans, and the Nephilim, but it does not explain the story in the detailed form that later readers came to know. There is no extended account of their lives, no complete description of their society, and no explanation of every relationship between these figures. The ancient text leaves a space, and later Jewish writers filled that space in different ways. One of the most influential developments appears in the Enochic tradition, where the mysterious heavenly beings become associated with the Watchers. In the expanded story, these beings descend to the human world and enter relationships with human women. Their actions are connected with the birth of giants and with a wider disturbance of the order between heaven and earth. The Book of Enoch develops this material far beyond the brief account in Genesis, adding names, events, journeys, judgments, and explanations that are absent from the biblical passage itself. This is one reason the Enochic writings are so valuable for understanding ancient interpretation. They show that readers in the Second Temple period did not always approach earlier scriptures as closed texts whose meaning could never be expanded. Older stories could become foundations for new literary works, and familiar figures could acquire much larger roles. The giants became especially useful within this developing tradition because they allowed ancient writers to connect physical destruction with moral disorder. In the Enochic story, the violence associated with the giants is not presented simply as a tale about unusually large people. It becomes part of a broader explanation for why divine judgment is necessary before the flood. The Book of Giants takes this inherited material in another direction. Rather than merely repeating the account found in Enoch, it focuses attention on the giants themselves and gives them dreams, fears, and encounters with figures connected to the coming judgment. Because the surviving text is fragmented, the exact sequence cannot always be reconstructed with confidence. Still, enough remains to see that this was a developed literary tradition rather than a simple retelling of Genesis. The relationship between these texts also explains why the title, Book of Giants, needs to be handled carefully. The giants in these writings belong to an ancient religious narrative. They should not be treated as archaeological evidence for a race of physically enormous humans who once lived on Earth. Archaeology has not established such a population, and the ancient texts themselves belong to a world of symbolic and theological storytelling. Their importance lies elsewhere. They reveal how ancient communities interpreted a difficult biblical passage and transformed a few unexplained lines into a much larger meditation on disorder, judgment, and the boundaries between the human and heavenly realms. This process of expansion is familiar throughout the history of human culture. A brief memory can become a longer story when later generations ask questions that the original account does not answer. A name can gather new meanings. A small gap can become the center of an entire tradition. The same pattern can be seen in the history of Enoch. Genesis gives only a few details about him, yet later writers imagined him as a witness to realities beyond ordinary human experience. The story of the giants followed a similar path. A few ancient lines became the foundation for elaborate traditions that eventually appeared in works copied in different languages and preserved by different communities. By the time fragments of the Book of Giants reached the caves near the Dead Sea, the story had already travelled a considerable distance through human memory and literary tradition. What the fragments allow us to see is not the original moment when the story was created, but one stage in a long process of interpretation. And that leaves a quiet question hanging over the surviving manuscripts. When a story grows far beyond its earliest form, how much of what we read belongs to the beginning, and how much belongs to the generations that came afterward? The name Enoch can make an ancient tradition appear more unified than it really was. In a modern book, one title usually points to one work, one sequence, and one stable body of writing. The material associated with Enoch does not fit that pattern. What is now commonly called First Enoch is a collection of several writings that developed within the Jewish world of the Second Temple period. They were connected by the figure of Enoch and by recurring concerns about heaven, judgment, wisdom, time, and human behavior, but they were not necessarily produced as one continuous composition by one writer at one moment. This distinction is essential when we place the Book of Giants beside Enoch. The Book of Giants belongs to the broader Enochic tradition, yet it should not simply be treated as a missing chapter from First Enoch. The surviving evidence points towards separate compositions that shared related stories and ideas. Several major literary units are now recognized within First Enoch. The Book of Watchers develops the story of the heavenly watchers and the giants, while other portions turn towards subjects such as the movements of heavenly bodies, symbolic visions of history, judgment, and instruction. These writings have different emphases and literary forms. Their association with Enoch gave them a common voice, but that common voice did not erase their differences. The figure of Enoch himself comes from a very brief passage in Genesis. There, he appears among the generations before the flood, and is described in unusual terms, including the statement that he walked with God and was taken by God. Later Jewish writers found in this short description a figure suitable for much larger stories about knowledge, heavenly journeys, and the structure of the cosmos. Over time, Enoch became more than the brief ancestor known from Genesis. His name became attached to writings that explored questions extending far beyond the original biblical passage. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide important evidence for this development. Among the manuscripts found near Qumran are fragments of Enochic writings written in Aramaic. Their existence shows that these traditions circulated in the ancient Jewish world during the Second Temple period. The fragments also demonstrate that the later history of Enoch cannot be understood only from the complete Ethiopic form known today. Earlier witnesses existed, but they survive unevenly. Some passages are preserved in fragments, some in later copies, and some only through comparisons between different textual traditions. That uneven survival is one of the central facts of ancient literary history. A modern reader can see a complete translation on a page, but the ancient process behind that page involved physical manuscripts that could decay, disappear, or remain untouched for centuries. A community might preserve one writing while another related work was not copied again. A text could travel into another language, acquire variations through copying, or survive only because a later community continued to value it. The same problem existed before writing. Human knowledge was carried through memory, repetition, teaching, and imitation, and each generation inherited only part of what earlier generations had known. Writing increased the durability of memory without making it permanent. Every surviving manuscript is therefore both evidence of preservation and evidence of loss. The Book of Giants makes this especially clear. Its fragments show that a developed story about the giants existed within the same broad Enochic world, but they do not allow us to reconstruct every detail of that story. Nor do they prove that the work was once physically attached to first Enoch and later removed. The safer conclusion is that ancient Jewish literature contained several related compositions, and that modern readers encounter only part of that larger landscape. Enoch was not simply one book waiting to be recovered in its original form. It was a tradition that grew, divided, travelled, and survived through different paths. The fragments from the Dead Sea, therefore, do not merely add pages to a familiar volume. They reveal how much larger and less uniform the ancient world of Enoch once was. When we look at the Enochic writings as a whole, the first thing to notice is not how complete they appear in modern editions, but how many different stages of transmission stand behind them. A reader holding a modern translation can easily imagine a single ancient author sitting down with a complete story and writing from the first sentence to the last. The surviving evidence does not support such a simple picture. The Enochic tradition developed through multiple compositions, copies, languages, and communities, and the manuscripts preserved at different places and times do not all contain the same material. This makes the history of Enoch less like the survival of one uninterrupted book, and more like the survival of several connected streams that sometimes meet and sometimes remain separate. Some of the earliest evidence comes from fragments written in Aramaic among the Dead Sea Scrolls. These fragments demonstrate that important Enochic writings circulated in the Second Temple period. They are especially valuable because they allow scholars to compare earlier textual witnesses with later versions preserved in other languages. Yet the fragments are incomplete, and their condition means that reconstruction requires careful comparison rather than imagination. A missing line is not automatically recoverable. The modern text is therefore the result of scholarship, working across several kinds of evidence. First, Enoch itself contains several distinct literary collections. The Book of Watchers presents the story of the Watchers and the origins of the giants within a framework of heavenly judgment. The astronomical book turns toward the ordered movements of the sun, moon, stars, and calendar. The dream visions present symbolic accounts connected with human history and judgment. The Epistle of Enoch gathers teaching and warnings, while the parables preserve another developed tradition concerned with judgment and heavenly authority. These writings are connected by the figure of Enoch, but their differences are significant. They show that Enoch was not simply a character in one story. His name became a literary vehicle through which different writers and communities could express ideas about time, judgment, wisdom, human behavior, and the relationship between heaven and earth. The transmission of these writings also reminds us that ancient literature did not have the same boundaries that modern readers often expect. A manuscript could preserve one composition without preserving another related work. A community could value one tradition more strongly than another. A text might be copied in Aramaic and later survive through a different linguistic tradition. Another work might disappear almost entirely, while a related composition continued to circulate. This uneven survival becomes especially important when we ask what happened to the Book of Giants. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve fragments of it, but those fragments do not show that it was once a missing portion physically removed from an otherwise complete copy of Enoch. The evidence points instead toward a separate composition that belonged to the same broader intellectual and religious environment. That distinction protects us from a tempting but unsupported conclusion. If one manuscript survives and another does not, the absence of the second does not prove that someone deliberately erased it. Ancient texts were vulnerable to ordinary processes of loss. Materials deteriorated. Copies were not always replaced. Languages changed. Communities disappeared or changed their reading habits. Some works simply ceased to be copied. The earliest human communities faced the same fundamental problem even before writing existed. A story remembered by one generation could change when passed to another, and a story that no one repeated could vanish completely. Writing gave traditions a physical form, but that form still depended on human hands. Every surviving manuscript is therefore both a record of what was preserved and a reminder of what cannot be recovered. The Enochic tradition makes this especially visible because several related works survive through different paths. What we call First Enoch today is a carefully reconstructed collection of ancient writings, while the Book of Giants stands nearby as another witness to the same larger world. Its presence among the Dead Sea Scrolls does not complete Enoch for us. Instead, it widens the landscape, showing that the ancient tradition surrounding Enoch was more varied than the boundaries of any surviving book. Once the different writings associated with Enoch are placed beside one another, another question begins to emerge. If they were not originally one continuous book, why did the name Enoch become attached to so many different traditions? The answer is not completely known, but the ancient evidence gives us a useful direction. Enoch was an unusually suitable figure for later writers because the biblical account had already given him an unusual place in human history. He belonged to the generations before the flood, yet Genesis describes him as someone who walked with God and was taken away. The passage is brief enough to leave many questions unanswered. Later writers could therefore expand his character without having to overturn a long biblical biography. Enoch could become a witness, a teacher, a traveler through heavenly realms, or a recipient of knowledge that ordinary human beings could not easily obtain. Different communities could use the same respected name while developing different literary concerns. This helps explain why the writings associated with Enoch are varied. One tradition could focus on the Watchers and the origins of the giants. Another could examine the movements of the sun and moon and the ordering of time. Another could present visions of history through symbolic animals and dramatic changes in the world. The connection was not necessarily a claim that one historical person had personally written every word. In ancient Jewish literature, important names could function as authoritative voices through which later writers presented teachings or visions. The same broader pattern appears in other ancient traditions, although each tradition has its own history. For Enoch, the result was a body of literature that modern scholars can identify as related without pretending that every composition came from the same hand. The Book of Giants is especially valuable because it reveals another branch of this literary development. It takes the ancient story of the giants and gives it a narrative shape that differs from the form preserved in the Book of Watchers. The surviving fragments mention figures connected with the giants and preserve episodes involving dreams and approaching judgment. Yet because the manuscripts are damaged, the complete story cannot be recovered with certainty. This limitation is not a weakness to be hidden. It is part of the evidence itself. When historians work with fragments, they must distinguish between what the surviving words establish and what can only be proposed as a reconstruction. That discipline becomes particularly important when a missing passage seems capable of answering a fascinating question. A gap in an ancient manuscript can invite the imagination to fill it, but imagination cannot become evidence simply because the missing story would be satisfying. The same principle applies to the relationship between the Book of Giants and First Enoch. The presence of similar characters and themes shows a close literary relationship, but similarity alone does not prove that one work was removed from another. Ancient writers could reuse older traditions, reshape familiar stories, and develop parallel versions without creating a single master text. The human need to preserve meaningful stories also helps explain why these traditions could change while remaining recognizable. Before writing became common, knowledge traveled through people who remembered, repeated, taught, and adapted what they had received. Once writing became part of cultural life, Manuscripts offered another way to carry those memories across generations, but preservation still depended on people. A scroll needed someone willing to copy it, someone able to read its language, and a community that considered it worth keeping. The Enochic tradition survived through this chain of human attention. Some links remain visible in the manuscripts, others have disappeared. What we call Enoch today is therefore not the complete remains of one untouched ancient volume. It is the surviving shape of a much wider tradition, reconstructed from different witnesses and surrounded by the silence of works and passages that no longer remain. The Book of Giants does not close that silence. It makes the silence easier to see. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls begins with something much quieter than the legends that later grew around them. It begins with pieces of ancient writing preserved in a dry landscape near the Dead Sea. In the middle of the 20th century, caves in the region of Qumran became known for containing manuscripts that had remained hidden for many centuries. The discoveries included biblical texts, religious writings, rules, poems, interpretations, and works that modern readers had never known in complete form. Among these manuscripts were fragments connected with the Enochic tradition, including copies of material associated with the Book of Giants. Their importance is not that they suddenly revealed a secret ancient world that had been completely unknown. Their importance is that they gave historians physical evidence from the Second Temple period for literary traditions that had previously been known through other, often much later, witnesses. The landscape itself helps explain why preservation was possible. The caves lie beside a region that is extremely dry, and dryness can slow the processes that normally destroy organic materials. But the survival of a manuscript is never guaranteed simply because it enters a cave. Ancient writing materials could still deteriorate, break, become buried, or be damaged by changes in the environment. What remains today is therefore the result of a long chain of circumstances that happened to preserve particular objects while countless others disappeared. This uneven survival is one of the first things to remember when looking at the scrolls. The manuscripts were not a complete library of every text known in ancient Judea. They are a surviving collection associated with particular communities and historical circumstances. The contents reflect the interests and activities of people who lived in the region, but they cannot tell us everything that every Jewish community believed or read. Some writings appear in multiple copies, while others are represented by only small fragments. Some texts were already known from later traditions, while others became much better understood only after their discovery. The Enochic manuscripts belong within this larger pattern. Their presence shows that Enochic literature circulated in the period when the scrolls were being copied and used. This is especially significant because the complete form of First Enoch, familiar to many modern readers, was preserved much later in Ethiopic manuscripts. The Aramaic fragments from the Dead Sea region provide an earlier window into the history of those traditions. They allow scholars to examine wording, themes, and relationships between manuscripts across different stages of transmission. Yet the fragments also impose a limit. A broken manuscript cannot tell us everything about the original copy from which it came. If only part of a page survives, the missing portion remains missing unless another independent witness preserves it. Even then, scholars must determine whether the texts truly correspond and whether differences reflect copying, translation, or separate development. The same physical problem existed throughout the history of writing. A human community could preserve a story for generations, but the survival of the physical record depended on materials and circumstances beyond anyone's control. Before written records, the same fragile chain existed in memory. Knowledge about ancestors, places, seasons, and distant events could survive only while people continued to remember and transmit it. The Dead Sea Scrolls offer a rare glimpse into one stage of that long human effort to preserve meaning. Their value is therefore not limited to the words written on their surfaces. They also reveal how much history depends on fragments. A small piece of parchment can establish that a tradition existed at a particular time, while still leaving enormous questions unanswered. For the Book of Giants, this distinction becomes especially important. The fragments confirm that the story circulated within the ancient Enochic world, but they do not restore the entire story. They give us a doorway into the tradition, not a complete view of everything that once stood beyond it. the importance of the Dead Sea Scrolls becomes clearer when we ask what historians actually had before these manuscripts were discovered. The traditions associated with Enoch were not completely unknown. Parts of the Enochic literature had survived through later transmission, especially in the Ethiopic language, and scholars could study those later witnesses. But a later manuscript is not the same thing as an earlier physical witness. It may preserve ancient material faithfully, yet it also stands farther away from the period in which that material was first composed and circulated. The fragments found near the Dead Sea changed the situation because they provided earlier evidence that several Enochic traditions were already being copied and preserved in the Second Temple period. This difference is easy to underestimate. When a historian studies a story that has survived through centuries of copying, every additional witness from an earlier period can help clarify how the text developed. A fragment does not need to contain a complete story to be valuable. Even a damaged piece can establish that a particular tradition existed in a certain linguistic and historical environment. The Aramaic Enochic manuscripts from Qumran are important for precisely this reason. They show that Enochic literature was not simply a much later creation attached retroactively to an ancient biblical name. Related writings were circulating among Jewish communities during the period in which the Second Temple still stood. The Book of Giants is especially significant within this evidence. Its fragments preserve a composition connected to the Watchers and Giants traditions, but the surviving pieces are not arranged like a complete modern narrative. Some contain portions of dreams and conversations, while other fragments preserve names or episodes that can be compared with related traditions. Scholars can place these pieces beside other ancient witnesses and examine similarities and differences, but the process requires caution. A similar name does not automatically prove that two passages originally stood next to one another. A shared theme does not prove that one author copied directly from another. Ancient writers could inherit a common tradition and reshape it independently. The scrolls therefore give us evidence of a literary environment rather than a simple chain of one text becoming another. This is one reason the discovery matters so much for the history of human ideas. We often imagine that ancient stories existed in a fixed form and were simply passed unchanged from one generation to the next. Manuscripts suggest something more complicated. Traditions could remain recognizable while their wording, arrangement, and emphasis changed. Different communities could preserve different portions. Some works could circulate widely, while others remain known within smaller groups. A story about Enoch or the giants could therefore have more than one textual life. The physical manuscripts also remind us that preservation was never automatic. A community needed to possess a copy, protect it, and continue to value it. A work that lost its readers could disappear even if its contents had once been important. The earliest human relationship with knowledge was built on the same fragile principle. Before writing, memories survived through repeated telling and careful teaching. With writing, words could outlast an individual voice, but they still depended on people and materials. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived because a particular combination of human choices and environmental conditions allowed them to remain. Their discovery gives us a rare view of one moment in the long history of preservation, yet it also teaches restraint. The fragments can show that the Book of Giants existed and circulated in an ancient Enochic setting. They can help compare versions and reconstruct portions of the text. They cannot tell us everything that was once written, everything that was once believed, or everything that disappeared before the manuscripts were ever placed in the caves. What they offer is smaller and more valuable, a physical trace strong enough to anchor part of the story in history, while leaving the remaining spaces honestly open. A fragment can sometimes tell us more by what it establishes than by what it reveals. A small piece of an ancient manuscript may preserve only a few lines, yet those lines can confirm that a particular story existed in a certain language and period. At the same time, the missing portions remain outside our reach. This tension is central to the Book of Giants. The manuscripts from the Dead Sea region do not give us a complete version of the work. They give us pieces from which scholars can identify characters, themes, episodes, and relationships with other Enochic writings. Some fragments can be placed together with reasonable confidence because their wording and physical features connect them. Other reconstructions remain more uncertain. This is why responsible study of the scrolls often sounds less dramatic than popular retellings. The evidence is powerful precisely because scholars allow it to remain limited. The Book of Giants demonstrates that stories about the Watchers and Giants circulated within the Jewish world of the Second Temple period, but the surviving pieces cannot recover every detail of the tradition. They cannot tell us exactly how every ancient reader understood the story, nor can they reveal every version that may once have existed. The same caution applies to the relationship between the Book of Giants and the better-known Enochic writings. Their similarities are meaningful. Both belong to a literary environment concerned with the Watchers, the Giants, human disorder, and divine judgment. Yet similarities do not erase differences. The Book of Giants has its own narrative emphasis, and its fragments preserve material that is not simply a duplicate of the surviving Book of Watchers. The scrolls therefore expand our picture of Enochic literature by showing that the ancient tradition contained more than the versions that happened to survive through later transmission. There is another quiet lesson here, one that reaches beyond ancient religious literature. Human history is often reconstructed from incomplete remains. Archaeologists work with broken buildings, scattered objects, worn tools, and traces in the ground. Historians work with letters, inscriptions, manuscripts, and later accounts. None of these sources provides an untouched view of the past. Each is a surviving piece shaped by the conditions that allowed it to remain. The same principle applies to the origins of human knowledge itself. Long before people wrote stories on parchment, communities carried information through memory and repeated practice. A remembered place could remain known for generations, while another memory could vanish when the last person who carried it died. Writing changed the material form of memory, but it did not remove the possibility of loss. The Dead Sea Scrolls are remarkable because some of those fragile chains happen to survive. Their caves preserve evidence of people who lived in a particular historical landscape, copied texts, read traditions, and placed written materials within a physical environment that eventually protected them. But preservation should not be confused with completeness. The caves did not preserve everything that ancient people knew. They preserved what happened to remain under particular circumstances. This is especially important for the question implied by the title of this journey. Asking what the Dead Sea Scrolls left out of Enoch can suggest that a deliberate omission must have occurred. The surviving evidence does not establish such a conclusion. What we can say is that the scrolls preserve some Enochic writings and fragments of the Book of Giants, while other parts of the ancient literary world are missing. Some may have disappeared through ordinary processes of transmission. Some may survive elsewhere in forms not yet recognized. Some may simply be gone. The distinction between these possibilities is impossible to ignore. The most honest history does not turn every gap into a secret. Sometimes a fragment is valuable because it proves that something existed while refusing to tell us everything about it. The Book of Giants leaves us precisely that kind of evidence, a partial voice from an ancient tradition whose surviving words are enough to be heard, but not enough to make the silence disappear. The Book of Giants enters the story as a work that is close to the Enochic tradition without simply being another name for it. Its surviving fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they preserve a narrative centered on the giants who appear in the wider story of the Watchers. The work is known from Aramaic manuscripts, and its damaged condition means that no complete ancient copy has survived. What remains is enough to recognize a developed literary composition, but not enough to reconstruct every sentence or every transition with certainty. That combination of clarity and uncertainty is important. We know the work existed, we can identify some of its major characters and themes, and we can compare portions of it with other ancient traditions. At the same time, the missing material cannot simply be supplied from imagination. The title itself tells us something about the difference between this composition and the better-known portions of First Enoch. The story turns attention toward the giants, descendants associated with the union between the Watchers and human women in the broader Enochic tradition. In Genesis, the Nephilim appear only briefly before the flood. Later Enochic literature expands their story, and the Book of Giants develops the giants into central figures within a narrative about approaching judgment. This expansion reflects a common feature of ancient literature. A short and mysterious passage can become the starting point for a much larger story when later writers explore questions that the earlier text leaves unanswered. The Book of Giants appears to have taken material already circulating within the Watchers' tradition and reshaped it into a narrative with its own emphasis. The giants are not presented merely as enormous bodies moving through an ancient landscape. Their importance comes from their place within a world that has become disordered. The surviving fragments contain dreams, names, conversations, and signs associated with the coming destruction. These elements create a story concerned not only with physical power, but with awareness of approaching judgment. Some of the most recognizable figures in the fragments are giants named Oya and Haya, while other material connects the story with the Watchers. The exact relationships between all surviving pieces are not always certain, because the manuscripts are incomplete, and some passages are preserved only in damaged form. This is where the Book of Giants becomes particularly interesting as a historical source. It is neither a simple copy of an older story nor a modern invention. It is an ancient composition that preserves a particular interpretation of an older tradition. Its survival among the Dead Sea Scrolls gives us physical evidence that such a version circulated within the Jewish world of the Second Temple period. Yet the manuscript evidence also prevents us from treating the surviving narrative as the whole story. There may have been opening passages that no longer survive, transitions between episodes that have disappeared, and conclusions that are only partially preserved. The gaps are not invitations to invent details. They are reminders of how ancient literature actually reaches us. A manuscript begins its life as an object made by human hands. It is read, copied, carried, stored, damaged, forgotten, rediscovered, and sometimes preserved by circumstances no one could have predicted. The same broad process shaped the survival of human knowledge long before writing existed. A community could remember a story for generations, but only while people continued to carry it. The Book of Giants gives us a written example of that fragile continuity. Its fragments are enough to show that an ancient story about the giants once had a fuller existence, but they also make visible the distance between what once existed and what can now be recovered. The work therefore stands beside Enoch not as a missing piece that completes it, but as another surviving window into the same ancient landscape. The surviving fragments of the Book of Giants become more meaningful when they are placed beside the older story from Genesis and the expanded account found in the Enochic tradition. Genesis gives only a few lines about the mysterious beings connected with the human world before the flood. The later Enochic writings develop those lines into a much larger account of the Watchers, the giants, and the consequences that follow. The Book of Giants then takes another step, shifting much of its attention toward the giants themselves and the strange experiences that accompany their final days. This does not mean that every detail of the story can be reconstructed. The manuscripts are fragmented, and some passages survive only as small pieces. Still, enough remains to show that the work had its own narrative character. The giants are not simply mentioned as background figures. They occupy the center of a story concerned with dreams, uncertainty, violence, and the expectation of destruction. Among the names preserved in the fragments are Oya and Haya, figures associated with the giants' tradition. Their presence helps establish that the work was not merely a general discussion of enormous beings. It contained individual characters within a developed narrative. Another important figure is Marwe, a being connected with the Watcher's tradition who appears in the surviving material as a messenger. The fragments describe dreams and encounters that point toward a coming judgment. Although the damaged state of the manuscripts makes the complete sequence difficult to recover, the atmosphere is therefore different from a simple tale of physical strength. The giants may be powerful, but the story repeatedly places them within a world where power cannot prevent the consequences already approaching. That narrative structure matters because it shows how ancient writers could use a traditional story to explore a larger question about order. The giants are connected with the disruption of boundaries between heavenly beings and humans, and their eventual fate becomes part of the restoration of a world that has been disturbed. The Book of Giants does not need to be read as a literal account of prehistoric events for this structure to have meaning. Its value as an ancient document comes from what it reveals about the people who created, copied, and preserved the story. They inherited older traditions and gave them new literary forms. The same process can be seen in the development of many ancient narratives. A brief ancestral story can gather additional characters. A mysterious name can become the center of a larger episode. A few unexplained lines can inspire generations of interpretation. For the history of humanity, This process is important because it shows how communities preserve the past by transforming it. Memory is rarely a perfect mirror. Even when a community tries to preserve an old story, each act of copying or retelling takes place in a new historical setting. The language may change, the concerns of the audience may change, the form of the story may change, yet enough of the older material can remain recognizable for the tradition to continue. The Book of Giants appears to stand at one of these points of transformation. Its authors worked with traditions that were already older than the surviving manuscripts, but they shaped those traditions into a composition with its own emphasis. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve traces of that process. They do not preserve the moment when the story first entered human memory, and they do not preserve the complete version that ancient readers once encountered. What they preserve is a later physical witness to a tradition that had already developed. That distinction allows the story to remain both fascinating and historically grounded. The giants can be studied as characters within an ancient religious narrative, while the manuscripts can be studied as evidence for how that narrative circulated. Neither requires us to turn the story into an archaeological claim about enormous humans. The surviving evidence points toward literature, transmission, and interpretation, and those are already enough to reveal a great deal about the ancient world that produced the text. The surviving pieces of the Book of Giants become especially revealing when we stop asking what the giants were supposed to look like, and begin asking what role they served within the story. The ancient composition does not survive as a complete narrative, so any reconstruction must remain cautious, but the fragments indicate that the giants were placed inside a world already disturbed by the actions of the Watchers. Their presence represents the consequences of a boundary being crossed between the heavenly and human realms. The story, therefore, has less to do with physical size than a modern reader might first expect. The giants matter because of where they come from, what happens around them, and what their eventual destruction means within the larger narrative. This becomes clearer through the dreams preserved in the fragments. Dreams are not presented simply as ordinary nighttime experiences. Within the literary world of the Book of Giants, they become a means through which the giants encounter signs of a future they cannot fully understand. The presence of dreams gives the story a quiet tension. The characters possess strength, yet they receive warnings that strength cannot explain. They experience uncertainty before the approaching judgment, and other figures become necessary to interpret what the dreams might mean. Among the surviving material, Mawe plays an important role in carrying a message connected with the coming judgment. The fragments do not preserve every step of the story, and scholars must therefore resist turning partial evidence into a complete sequence. Still, the repeated relationship between dreams, interpretation, and impending destruction is clear enough to show that the narrative is concerned with knowledge as much as with power. The giants can occupy an imposing place within the story while remaining unable to control what is coming. That contrast gives the composition its distinctive character. It also connects the Book of Giants to a broader pattern found in ancient literature, where dreams and visions can reveal a limitation in human understanding. A person may see something without knowing what it means. A warning may arrive without providing the ability to prevent what follows. Such ideas do not require us to assume that ancient writers were describing actual supernatural events. They can be understood as features of a religious narrative through which communities explored questions about disorder, responsibility, and judgment. The archaeological evidence adds another layer. The Dead Sea Scrolls demonstrate that copies of this tradition existed in the ancient Jewish world, but they do not demonstrate that the giants themselves existed as a historical population of enormous humans. No responsible reconstruction should move from a literary description directly to an archaeological conclusion. The ancient world contained many forms of storytelling, and the presence of a story in a manuscript tells us that people preserved the story, not that every event within it occurred exactly as described. This distinction is especially important because the word giants can easily lead modern readers toward a physical interpretation. In the surviving literary context, however, their identity is tied to the larger theological story of the Watchers and the Flood. Their bodies are not the only thing that makes them unusual. Their place within the structure of the narrative is what gives them meaning. The story also carries a deeper historical lesson about how traditions evolve. Genesis provides a short and difficult passage. Later writers interpret it, expand it, and create new narratives around it. The Book of Giants represents one of those developments. The Dead Sea manuscripts then preserve only part of the resulting composition, leaving later generations to reconstruct its outline from fragments. What survives is therefore layered memory, an old biblical reference, an expanded ancient interpretation, a developed literary work, and finally the physical remains of manuscripts that themselves survived by chance and circumstance. Each layer takes us farther from the original beginning, while also giving us another piece of evidence about how human beings carried stories through time. The giants remain at the center of that process, not as a proven forgotten race, but as figures through whom an ancient community explored what happens when familiar boundaries are broken, and when even those who seem powerful cannot escape the limits imposed by their world. The giants become more interesting when the story is viewed not through their physical size, but through the disorder surrounding them. In the surviving Book of Giants material, they belong to a world that has already been disturbed by the actions of the Watchers. Their existence is part of a larger chain of events that connects heavenly beings, human communities, violence, and the approaching judgment associated with the flood. This gives the giants a role that is different from the simple image of enormous people wandering through an ancient landscape. They represent consequences within a story about boundaries that have been crossed. The surviving fragments do not provide a complete description of their daily lives, their bodies, or their environment, and filling those gaps with modern imagination would create a picture that the evidence cannot support. What can be studied is the narrative structure that remains. Violence appears as one of the important elements connected with the giants and with the wider corruption described in the Enochic tradition. The story presents a world in which ordinary limits have become unstable. The Watchers have entered the human sphere, the giants have emerged from that union, and destructive behavior becomes part of the resulting disorder. The point is not simply that the giants are strong. Their strength exists within a system that is already moving toward collapse. That distinction matters because ancient writers often use stories about disorder to explore the consequences of actions rather than to describe events in the modern historical sense. The Book of Giants belongs to this literary environment. Its narrative is concerned with what happens when boundaries are crossed and when the consequences spread beyond the people who first caused them. The giants, therefore, become part of a larger moral and cosmic structure. Yet it would be too simple to say that the story is merely a lesson about punishment. The surviving fragments introduce uncertainty through dreams, warnings, and attempts to understand what is coming. The giants are not simply told that destruction will occur and then immediately removed from the narrative. Their dreams create a period in which the meaning of events remains unclear. This makes the story more reflective than a simple account of violence. The characters are confronted with signs that require interpretation, while the audience is given only fragments of the original narrative through the surviving manuscripts. There is an unexpected connection between the two forms of uncertainty. The giants within the story struggle to understand warnings, while modern readers struggle to understand a damaged text. In both cases, knowledge is incomplete. The comparison should not be taken as something the ancient authors intended, but it helps explain why the surviving work can feel unusually distant. We do not possess every piece needed to reconstruct its original sequence, and the characters themselves are portrayed as living within a world where the future is not fully understood. This is one reason the Book of Giants should be approached slowly. The most responsible reading does not rush from a strange image to a dramatic conclusion. It asks what the manuscript actually preserves, what can be compared with related Enochic traditions, and where uncertainty remains. The same discipline has always been necessary in the study of human origins. Archaeologists rarely find complete settlements exactly as they once existed. They find traces, tools, bones, structures, layers of soil, fragments of objects. Each trace can tell something, but no single trace contains the entire human story. The Dead Sea Scrolls work in much the same way. A fragment can establish that a literary tradition existed. Several fragments can reveal parts of its structure, but the missing portions remain missing. The Book of Giants, therefore, offers a quiet lesson about evidence. A story can survive strongly enough to be studied without surviving completely enough to answer every question. Its fragments show an ancient concern with disorder, violence, dreams, and judgment, while the gaps remind us that history does not always preserve the explanations we most want to find. The dreams preserved in the Book of Giants introduce a different kind of movement into the story. Nothing needs to chase anyone through the landscape for the narrative to become unsettled. Instead, the disturbance arrives through images seen during sleep, followed by the uncertainty of not knowing what those images mean. This is one of the most distinctive features of the surviving material. The giants are powerful figures within the story, yet they encounter experiences that cannot be understood through physical strength. Their dreams suggest that something beyond their immediate world is approaching, while the interpretation of those dreams becomes a problem in itself. The surviving fragments connect this process with Marwe, a figure associated with the Watchers who becomes involved in carrying or interpreting a message. Because the manuscripts are incomplete, scholars cannot reconstruct every detail of his journey with certainty. Some episodes are preserved only in fragments, and the exact order of portions of the narrative remains a subject of careful textual reconstruction. What can be said more securely is that the story uses dreams and messages to create awareness of an approaching judgment. This gives the Book of Giants a structure built around anticipation rather than spectacle. The giants do not simply encounter destruction without warning. They experience signs that suggest the stability of their world is temporary. The literary effect is quiet but important. A dream can make a person aware of danger without revealing exactly how that danger will arrive. It can create uncertainty rather than certainty. Ancient readers did not necessarily need to regard such dreams as records of actual supernatural communication. Dreams were a familiar literary device in ancient storytelling, and they could be used to reveal hidden information, foreshadow events, or explore the limits of human understanding. Within the Book of Giants, they help shift the narrative away from physical size and toward knowledge, interpretation, and fear of an approaching change. This also connects the work with a wider pattern in the Enochic tradition. Heavenly knowledge is repeatedly associated with information that ordinary human beings do not possess. Enoch receives knowledge about the structure of the heavens. Other figures receive warnings about judgment. The giants encounter dreams that they cannot fully interpret. Different stories, therefore, return to a similar question. What happens when beings living within the human world become aware of realities larger than themselves? The answers vary, but the theme of limited understanding remains important. The Book of Giants does not portray knowledge as something that automatically gives control. A warning may be received without giving the recipient the ability to change the outcome. That distinction becomes especially clear when the story is placed against the flood tradition. The approaching destruction is part of a larger judgment already established within the Enochic narrative. The giants are not simply facing an ordinary military defeat or a natural disaster described in isolation. Their fate is connected to a cosmic and moral framework inherited from the older Watcher's story, yet the surviving fragments do not allow every detail of that framework to be reconstructed. Some sections have disappeared, and some words remain uncertain because the manuscripts are damaged. Responsible study, therefore, requires separating what the text clearly preserves from what later interpretation might add. The same caution applies to the question of Marwe. He can be identified in the surviving material, and his role is connected with communication and the giant's dreams, but the incomplete condition of the text prevents a perfectly continuous account of every action attributed to him. This is not unusual for ancient manuscripts. A fragmentary source often leaves historians with a series of secure points connected by uncertain spaces. The temptation is to fill those spaces with a smooth story. Scholarship, instead, leaves some spaces open. That practice may feel unsatisfying, but it protects the boundary between evidence and invention. The Book of Giants itself is a story about incomplete knowledge, and its modern recovery carries a similar lesson. The ancient characters receive signs whose meaning is difficult to grasp, while modern readers receive fragments whose original sequence is sometimes difficult to reconstruct. In both cases, the surviving evidence invites attention rather than certainty. What remains is enough to hear an ancient tradition speaking about dreams, warnings, and judgment, but not enough to erase the silence that surrounds it. The dreams of the giants become especially important when they are placed beside the wider Enochic idea that knowledge can arrive before understanding. A warning may appear, yet its meaning may remain uncertain. A sign may be recognized without its consequences being fully understood. In the Book of Giants, this tension allows the story to move away from the image of physical strength and toward a quieter question about human and non-human limitations. The giants occupy a powerful position within the narrative, but power does not provide them with complete knowledge of what is coming. Their dreams place them in a strange position. They are able to see something beyond the ordinary world of their experience, yet they cannot simply control what they have seen. This pattern is important because the story does not present knowledge as a magical form of protection. The presence of a warning does not necessarily remove the danger. Instead, the warning creates a period of uncertainty in which its meaning must be sought. The surviving fragments connect this process with figures who interpret or communicate the significance of the dreams. Marway is particularly important in this respect. His role belongs to the larger network of heavenly and human relationships, established by the Watcher's tradition, and the surviving material associates him with communication involving the giants. Yet the damaged manuscripts do not allow every part of his role to be reconstructed with complete confidence. This is a useful example of how ancient textual study works. A name can survive clearly while the surrounding sentences are broken. A sentence can preserve an action while the beginning or ending of the episode has disappeared. A later translation may preserve related material while differing in wording or arrangement. The result is a story that can be understood in outline but not always in every detail. The ancient narrative itself is also concerned with limits. The giants are not portrayed as beings who can simply escape the consequences of the world around them. Their dreams point toward destruction, and the larger Enochic tradition connects that destruction with judgment after the disorder caused by the Watchers. The giants therefore occupy an unusual position in the story. They are both powerful and vulnerable, significant and temporary. Their fate is tied to a world larger than themselves. This does not require us to interpret the story as a factual account of a forgotten population. The archaeological record does not establish the existence of a historical race of giants corresponding to the literary figures. The manuscript evidence establishes something different and historically valuable. Ancient people preserved and copied a story in which giants played an important role. That distinction allows the text to be studied without forcing it into a category it was never designed to occupy. It also returns us to the deeper question of why such a story was worth preserving. The Book of Giants belongs to a tradition concerned with the consequences of disorder, the limits of power, and the certainty of judgment within its religious worldview. Its giants are not simply large bodies. They are figures placed inside a narrative about a world that has crossed boundaries and is moving toward restoration through judgment. Their dreams make the story more inward. Instead of showing only what happens outside the characters, the narrative gives glimpses of uncertainty within them. That feature helps explain why the work can feel different from a straightforward account of ancient monsters. The most important movement is not across a landscape. It is from confidence toward uncertainty, from apparent power toward limitation, and from signs toward an outcome that the characters cannot fully prevent. The surviving manuscripts create another layer of that same movement for modern readers. We can recognize names, themes, and episodes, but the missing pieces prevent complete certainty. The result is not a failure of history. It is a reminder of how history actually survives. Human beings leave traces behind, but those traces are rarely complete. A tool can reveal a skill without revealing the person who made it. A burial can reveal something about a community without revealing every belief held by its members. A manuscript can preserve a story without preserving every sentence. The Book of Giants is one such trace. Its dreams remain, its warnings remain, and fragments of its characters remain, while much of the original narrative has fallen silent. The silence does not need to be filled to make the surviving words meaningful. The story becomes more difficult and more interesting when we turn from the giants themselves to the question of what happened to the writings that carried their story. The title asks what the Dead Sea Scrolls left out of Enoch, but the surviving evidence does not support the idea of a single complete book from which later communities deliberately removed selected chapters. The ancient Enochic tradition is better understood as a collection of related compositions that developed over time. First Enoch, as it exists today, brings together several distinct works or literary units associated with Enoch, and the Book of Giants belongs to a related but separate stream of tradition. This matters because the phrase "left out" can easily create an image of a missing chapter, carefully cut away from an otherwise complete manuscript. The manuscripts do not establish such a process. What they show is something quieter. Different Enochic writings circulated in different forms, and some survived while others did not. The history of these texts therefore resembles a branching path more than a single volume, with pages missing from the middle. The Book of Watchers developed one account of the Watchers and their consequences. The Book of Giants developed another narrative using related traditions. Other Enochic works explored calendars, heavenly movements, visions of history and future judgment. These writings were eventually transmitted through different communities and languages, and their paths through history were not identical. This helps explain why a work could be important in one period or community and yet fail to survive continuously into later centuries. Preservation was never simply a matter of whether a text was interesting. A manuscript had to be copied. Someone had to continue reading it. A community had to have a reason to keep producing new copies. If those conditions disappeared, the physical text could disappear with them. The history of human writing is therefore also a history of loss. Most ancient books known to us do not survive in their original copies. Many are known only through quotations, translations, fragments, references by later writers, or archaeological discoveries. Others are known only by their titles. Some have vanished almost completely, leaving behind no reliable trace. The Book of Giants is unusual because fragments survived in the Dead Sea region, and related versions or fragments have also been identified elsewhere, giving scholars more than one kind of evidence for its existence and transmission. Yet even this survival is incomplete. We cannot reconstruct every line that once belonged to the composition. We cannot know with certainty how every ancient reader interpreted it. We cannot assume that the surviving manuscripts represent every version that circulated. The physical remains give us a narrow window into a much wider literary world. This is where the history of Enoch becomes connected to the larger history of human memory. Before writing, every tradition depended upon living minds. After writing, memory became partly externalized onto material objects, but it remained dependent on human communities. A written story did not become immortal simply because someone placed it on parchment. The parchment could decay. A copy could be lost. A language could become unfamiliar. A community could stop reading the work. Another tradition could become more influential and receive more attention from later scribes. Across human history, countless ideas have disappeared through these ordinary processes. The surviving Enochic texts are therefore not merely unusual religious documents. They are examples of how cultural memory works. They show that a tradition can remain recognizable while changing form, crossing languages and surviving unevenly. The Book of Giants is one surviving branch of that process. Its presence among the Dead Sea Scrolls tells us that its story existed within the ancient Jewish literary landscape. Its later disappearance from some traditions does not require a secret act of censorship. Sometimes history loses a book for reasons far less dramatic: fewer copies, fewer readers, changing communities, and the simple fragility of the materials on which human memory depends. The survival of the Enochic writings also raises a quieter question about authority. Why did some ancient Jewish writings continue to be copied and translated while others became less visible? The surviving evidence does not give us a single answer, and it would be misleading to imagine that one council simply selected the books that would survive and discarded everything else. The history was more gradual and varied. Different Jewish communities lived in different places, used different languages, and preserved different collections of writings. A text could be respected without becoming part of every community's scripture. Another could remain important within a particular group while gradually disappearing from wider circulation. This distinction is essential when thinking about Enoch. The ancient world did not possess one universally identical library. Textual authority could be distributed unevenly. The Dead Sea Scrolls make this visible because the collection contains writings that later became part of the Hebrew Bible, writings that were influential but not included in that collection, and compositions whose place within ancient Jewish literary culture is still being studied. Their coexistence inside the same archaeological setting reminds us that the boundaries between sacred, useful, traditional, and authoritative literature were not necessarily identical. The Book of Giants belongs within this complicated environment. Its presence among the manuscripts shows that someone considered the work worth copying and preserving. That does not prove that every Jewish community accepted its story as scripture, nor does it show that later communities deliberately rejected it because they knew it contained hidden information. A manuscript can be valuable without being universally authoritative. This is an important distinction because modern readers often approach ancient religious literature with categories that developed much later. We may imagine a fixed collection of approved books standing opposite a separate collection of forbidden books. The historical evidence is usually less tidy. Communities made choices over generations. Texts circulated, competed for attention, were translated, were copied, or gradually ceased to be copied. Language itself could affect survival. A work written in Aramaic might become harder to transmit when another language became dominant within a community. A composition could survive in translation while the original disappeared. Another could remain in one region and vanish elsewhere. The Enochic tradition illustrates this uneven movement particularly well. Parts of the tradition survived in Ethiopic manuscripts, while earlier Aramaic fragments survived among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of Giants also has evidence of transmission beyond the Qumran manuscripts, including versions preserved in other languages. Each witness adds another layer, but none gives us the complete original history. This is how cultural memory often works across generations. A story begins in one setting, moves into another, changes language, acquires new readers, and sometimes survives only because a small community continues to value it. The process resembles the movement of human populations through time, not because texts migrate in the same biological way, but because both are carried by generations. One generation receives something from another and decides, consciously or simply through practice, whether it will continue. A child learns a language because people around them use it. A reader learns a story because someone preserves and teaches it. A scribe copies a manuscript because the work still matters to someone. When that chain weakens, the tradition can become difficult to recover. The Dead Sea Scrolls allow us to see one moment within this long process, but they cannot reveal every choice made before or after the manuscripts were produced. This is why the absence of the Book of Giants from later biblical collections should not automatically be described as an omission from Enoch. The surviving evidence points instead toward a broader literary history in which several Enochic compositions existed alongside one another, with different patterns of circulation and later preservation. What disappeared was not necessarily removed. Sometimes a text simply stopped being copied often enough to survive. In the long history of human culture, absence can have many causes. The challenge is to distinguish the evidence for those causes from the stories we might prefer to tell about them. The question of what disappeared from the Enochic tradition becomes clearer when we look at the physical life of ancient books. A text could be composed with care and still vanish within a few generations if too few copies were made. A manuscript could be stored safely for a long time and then be damaged by moisture, insects, fire, conflict, or simple decay. A language could also change around it, leaving a work increasingly difficult for later readers to understand. None of these causes requires a deliberate decision to destroy a book. They are ordinary forces of historical loss, and they have shaped the survival of human knowledge for as long as people have tried to preserve it. The Book of Giants survived because copies were made in an ancient period, and because at least some fragments eventually remained in conditions capable of protecting them. That survival is remarkable, but it should not make us forget how much else was lost. The Dead Sea Scrolls themselves are a collection of survivors. They are not a complete record of everything that was written, read, or believed in the communities that produced them. Their contents give us evidence of particular interests and traditions, but the absence of another text cannot by itself prove that the text was rejected. This is especially important when considering the relationship between the Book of Giants and the Enochic corpus. The Book of Giants was not simply a missing chapter from the form of First Enoch that later readers inherited. It belonged to a related literary tradition and developed its own narrative about the giants, their dreams, and the judgment that awaited them. Some ancient copies of Enochic writings may have circulated together, while other compositions may have existed separately. The surviving manuscripts do not provide enough evidence to reconstruct one universal ancient edition containing every Enochic work. Instead, they reveal a literary environment in which related traditions could exist beside one another. That environment was shaped by people living in particular places and particular generations. A scribe copying an older composition was not merely preserving ink on parchment. The act of copying placed an old story into a new historical moment. The language, spelling, arrangement, and even the physical condition of the manuscript could change. Sometimes a copy might preserve an older reading more accurately than another witness. Sometimes it might contain a mistake. Sometimes a damaged passage could become difficult for a later copyist to understand. Over generations, these small changes could accumulate while the basic identity of the tradition remained recognizable. The history of Enochic literature, therefore, resembles a long chain of transmission with many branches. Some branches remain visible, others end in silence. The Book of Giants is one of the branches that can still be followed because its fragments provide enough evidence to identify the work and compare it with related traditions. Yet the surviving fragments cannot tell us whether every ancient version has been found. They cannot reveal how many copies once existed or exactly how widely the work circulated. The safest conclusion is also the most useful one. The text was important enough to be copied in more than one ancient context, but its later survival was uneven. That unevenness tells us something about cultural memory itself. Human beings do not preserve everything equally. What survives depends partly on what people value, what they can copy, what languages they understand, and what physical conditions protect their records. This was true for ancient communities and remains true for every generation that inherits knowledge from the past. The story of the Book of Giants, therefore, does not require a hidden hand removing pages from an otherwise complete book. Its history is more subtle. A tradition can divide into related writings, travel through different communities, survive in one language while disappearing in another, and reach the present through fragments rather than through a complete volume. The silence around the missing material is real, but silence is not proof of censorship. Sometimes the past leaves us a locked door without leaving a record of who closed it, or whether anyone closed it at all. The most important question now shifts from why a text survived to what the surviving Book of Giants actually contains. Among its fragments are names and episodes that make the ancient story more concrete. The giants are no longer only a brief reference inherited from Genesis. They appear as characters within a developed narrative, surrounded by dreams, messages, and signs of approaching destruction. Yet the fragments do not give us a continuous story from beginning to end. What survives comes in pieces, and some passages are damaged enough that interpretation must remain cautious. This means that the Book of Giants is best approached as a partially preserved literary work rather than as a complete account waiting to be read straight through. One of the most distinctive features is the attention given to dreams. The giants receive dreams that seem to warn them about events beyond their immediate understanding. In an ancient literary setting, such dreams can function as a way of revealing knowledge that ordinary experience cannot provide. They can also create uncertainty, because seeing an image does not necessarily explain its meaning. The giants therefore become figures who possess unusual strength while remaining dependent on interpretation. Their situation is very different from the modern image of a giant, as simply a larger human being. Within the story, their importance comes from their position in the wider Watcher's tradition and from the consequences associated with that tradition. Among the figures preserved in the fragments is Mawe, whose role connects the giants with the wider world of the Watchers. His appearance is significant because the narrative does not remain entirely inside the giant's own world. Information moves between different realms, and messages become part of the developing story. The damaged condition of the manuscripts makes it difficult to reconstruct every stage of this movement, but enough survives to show that communication and interpretation are central elements. The story is therefore concerned with knowledge arriving before the characters are ready to understand it. The names Ohia and Haya also survive in the fragments, giving the giants individual identities rather than leaving them as an anonymous group. This small detail changes the texture of the narrative. A tradition that begins with a mysterious reference to extraordinary beings becomes a story containing recognizable characters with separate roles. Their names also demonstrate why fragments matter to historians. A single preserved name can connect a damaged manuscript with a wider literary tradition and help establish that the composition once contained a more developed narrative than the surviving pieces alone might suggest. The physical evidence remains just as important as the story itself. These fragments are not modern summaries of an ancient legend. They are remnants of manuscripts written in antiquity, and their existence places the Book of Giants within the literary world of the Second Temple period. At the same time, manuscript evidence does not turn the giants into archaeological discoveries. The text tells us that ancient writers and readers preserved a tradition about them. It does not provide independent physical evidence that a historical population of enormous humans existed. Keeping those two levels separate allows the ancient story to be taken seriously without asking it to answer a question it was never designed to answer. This distinction reaches back to the earliest layers of human history. Human communities have always used stories to organize memories, explain difficult events, and connect generations with traditions inherited from the past. Long before manuscripts existed, such knowledge moved through speech, memory, imitation, and teaching. Writing later gave some of those traditions a more durable physical form, but the process remained vulnerable to loss. The Book of Giants is one surviving result of that long human effort to preserve meaning. Its fragments let us hear a tradition already ancient when these manuscripts were copied, while the missing portions remind us that no surviving document can carry the whole past. The dreams of the giants also reveal something about the kind of story the Book of Giants was trying to tell. The surviving fragments do not describe a world in which unusual beings simply possess extraordinary strength and dominate everything around them. Instead, they show figures confronted by information they cannot easily understand. A dream appears, its meaning becomes uncertain, and someone must attempt to interpret what has been seen. This gives the narrative a different center of gravity. Physical power remains part of the story, but knowledge becomes more important than size. The giants can be imposing figures and still remain uncertain about their future. That contrast is one reason the fragments are worth reading as literature rather than simply as a collection of strange ancient claims. The dream material also connects the Book of Giants with a broader tradition in ancient Jewish writing. Dreams and visions could serve as literary ways of revealing events that ordinary observation could not yet explain. They could warn of danger, disclose hidden information, or place a character in contact with a reality larger than the immediate human world. This does not require us to decide whether the ancient authors intended these experiences as literal supernatural events. For historical study, the important fact is that dreams were used as a meaningful literary device within the tradition. The Book of Giants uses that device to create a sense of approaching judgment. The characters receive indications that their world is moving toward an ending, but the surviving fragments do not preserve every step between the warning and the final outcome. This missing sequence is important because modern readers naturally want to complete it. When a few fragments preserve the beginning of an episode, the mind tends to imagine what must have followed. But a plausible continuation is not the same as an ancient one. The responsible approach is to distinguish reconstruction based on textual evidence from speculation created to make the story complete. This distinction becomes particularly important with the giants because later retellings have often combined details from different ancient traditions. The Book of Giants, the Book of Watchers, Genesis, and later interpretations all contain related material, but they are not interchangeable sources. Each belongs to a different stage or form of the tradition. When details are moved from one text into another without warning, the ancient evidence can appear more complete than it really is. The Dead Sea Scrolls help correct this problem because they allow scholars to examine early textual witnesses directly. The fragments show that the giants' tradition had already developed into a substantial narrative by the period in which these manuscripts were produced. They also show that the story was connected to a larger Enochic literary world rather than existing as an isolated legend. Yet the manuscripts do not tell us exactly how every reader understood the giants. A community could preserve a text for many reasons, and the survival of a manuscript does not provide a complete record of its audience. We can establish that the work circulated. We can compare its language and themes with related writings. We can identify characters and narrative elements. But the private thoughts of ancient readers remain beyond direct recovery. This limitation is important when considering the human origins of the story itself. The traditions behind the Book of Giants were shaped by people living within real historical communities, inheriting older scriptures and interpretations, observing changes in their society, and expressing religious ideas through familiar literary forms. Their world was not the distant prehistoric landscape sometimes imagined by modern retellings. It was a historical world of languages, communities, manuscripts, teachers, readers, and inherited traditions. The giants belong to that literary world. Their dreams belong to that world as well. When we follow the fragments carefully, the mystery becomes less about discovering a hidden population and more about understanding how an ancient community transformed a brief and difficult tradition into a larger story, then passed pieces of that story forward until only fragments remained. The names preserved in the Book of Giants give the fragments another kind of importance. The story becomes easier to recognize when its characters are no longer anonymous, because names create connections between separate pieces of evidence. Oya and Haya appear within the surviving material as individual giants, while Mawe is connected with the movement of information between the giants and the wider Watchers tradition. Yet even here, the evidence asks for restraint. A name preserved in one fragment does not automatically reveal the complete biography of the character. We do not know everything that ancient readers may have known about these figures, and the damaged state of the manuscripts prevents a continuous account from being reconstructed without uncertainty. What survives is enough to establish that the story contained named characters and developed episodes, but not enough to restore every relationship or event. This limitation becomes especially important when comparing the Book of Giants with other Enochic writings. The same broader tradition can contain overlapping names, themes, and events while presenting them differently. A later reader might combine these materials into one smooth narrative, but the ancient manuscripts themselves show that the literary history was more complex. Different compositions could preserve different versions of a shared tradition. The Book of Giants, therefore, should not be treated as a simple missing portion of another Enochic work. It is better understood as an independent composition that draws upon traditions also found elsewhere and gives them a particular narrative shape. This is one of the reasons the Dead Sea Scrolls changed the study of ancient Jewish literature. Before the discovery of the Qumran manuscripts, many ancient texts were known only through later copies or translations. Earlier witnesses can reveal that a tradition was already present much sooner than those later manuscripts might suggest. They can also show that a story existed in forms that are not identical to the versions preserved by later communities. The Book of Giants provides exactly this kind of evidence. Its Aramaic fragments demonstrate that the Giants tradition was circulating in an ancient Jewish setting during the Second Temple period. They do not establish every stage of its development, but they move the evidence much closer to the world in which the tradition took shape. That movement through time is important because texts do not emerge outside history. The people who composed and copied them lived within particular environments. They spoke particular languages. They inherited older stories and interpreted them through the concerns of their own communities. Even when a text presents events from a distant mythical past, the act of writing it belongs to a real historical moment. The Book of Giants therefore tells us about ancient Jewish literary culture, even though its narrative is set before the flood. This distinction also helps us understand why the giants should not be treated as evidence for an unknown branch of human evolution. The story belongs to a religious and literary tradition, not to a biological record. There is no need to transform its unusual characters into prehistoric humans simply because the narrative places them in an ancient world. Human history is already full of examples showing how communities use inherited stories to think about boundaries, disorder, responsibility, and judgment. The giants provide one such example. Their unusual nature makes them memorable, but their literary function makes them historically useful. Through them, the ancient writers could explore a world in which inherited boundaries had been broken and consequences were approaching. Through the surviving manuscripts, modern readers can observe how that story was preserved, and through the gaps in those manuscripts, we can see the limits of preservation itself. The missing words do not prove that someone intentionally removed them. They simply remind us that the past reaches the present unevenly. Some voices remain clear enough to identify, others survive only as faint traces, still others may have disappeared completely. The Book of Giants belongs to that fragile middle ground, where enough remains to reconstruct a tradition, but not enough to close every question surrounding it. That uncertainty is not something that needs to be overcome. It is part of what the ancient evidence actually says. The deeper we move into the Book of Giants, the more important the surrounding world becomes. The story does not exist in isolation. It belongs to a period when Jewish writers were thinking carefully about creation, corruption, judgment, angels, humanity, and the boundaries between different realms of existence. These concerns appear in several ancient writings, but they are expressed in different forms. The Book of Giants gives one particular shape to them by placing the giants at the center of a world that has become disordered. The disorder begins with the Watchers, whose descent into the human realm is part of the larger Enochic tradition. Their actions lead to relationships with human women and to the birth of the giants. From there, the narrative develops toward violence and judgment. This sequence matters because it shows that the giants are not introduced as an unexplained population appearing suddenly in an otherwise ordinary human landscape. Their identity is tied to a larger chain of events that the ancient writers considered important. That chain also helps explain why the story is concerned with boundaries. The ancient authors were not writing a biological account of human variation. They were working within a religious worldview in which different orders of existence had meaningful distinctions. When those distinctions are crossed, consequences follow. The giants therefore become part of a story about what happens when an established order is disturbed. Their unusual nature serves the narrative, but the deeper subject is the condition of the world around them. The surviving fragments are particularly valuable because they show how this older tradition could be developed into a narrative with named characters, dreams, messages, and approaching judgment. Yet the fragments also remind us that ancient literature did not always survive in a form that allows modern readers to follow every stage. Some passages are preserved clearly, while others are broken or incomplete. This means that the world described by the text must be separated from the world reconstructed by later imagination. The ancient story gives us giants. It does not give us archaeological remains of giants. It gives us a tradition about extraordinary beings. It does not provide independent biological evidence for a separate human population. This distinction is especially important when the story is connected with the history of human origins. The earliest human communities did live in landscapes that could seem immense and unfamiliar, surrounded by mountains, deserts, rivers, animals, and changing climates. They created stories to make sense of forces larger than individual lives, and those stories could preserve older traditions while also changing them. The writers behind the Enochic literature lived much later than the earliest stages of human evolution, but their questions were still connected to enduring human concerns. Where order comes from, what happens when boundaries are broken, and how a community should understand destruction and renewal. The Book of Giants gives us evidence of one ancient answer to those questions. Its giants are literary figures within a religious narrative, not forgotten members of human evolution. Their importance lies in what the story does with them. They embody the consequences of a world that has crossed its boundaries, while their dreams and warnings create a sense that judgment is approaching. The story therefore moves through several layers at once. There is an inherited biblical tradition, an expanded Enochic interpretation, a separate narrative about the giants, and finally the surviving manuscripts that allow us to study that narrative today. Each layer belongs to a different moment in history. None should be collapsed into another. When those layers are kept separate, the Book of Giants becomes less like a lost supernatural history and more like what the evidence can actually support. An ancient work that preserves how one community imagined a troubled world, transformed older traditions, and carried them forward through writing. The world behind the Book of Giants was not a world without history. The writers who shaped this tradition lived within communities that had inherited older scriptures, customs, languages, and stories, while also experiencing changes in their own time. That historical setting matters because ancient literature often carries traces of the questions its writers considered important. The Book of Giants looks toward a remote world before the flood, yet its existence belongs to a much later period of Jewish history. The story could therefore function as a way of thinking about order and disorder through a narrative located safely in the distant past. The ancient authors did not need to describe their own society directly in order to explore concerns about violence, boundaries, judgment, and the consequences of actions. The giants provided a powerful literary setting for those themes. Their extraordinary status allowed the writers to imagine what happens when the normal separation between heavenly beings and human beings is disturbed. Yet the story remains connected to ordinary human concerns. The giants dream, they seek interpretation, they receive warnings, they face uncertainty about what is approaching. These elements make the narrative less about physical size and more about the limits shared by beings who cannot fully control their circumstances. This also helps explain why the Book of Giants belongs naturally beside other Enochic compositions while remaining distinct from them. The broader Enochic tradition repeatedly explores knowledge that comes from beyond ordinary human experience. Enoch is associated with visions and heavenly knowledge. The Watchers possess knowledge and transmit practices that are presented as disruptive. The Giants receive dreams that point toward judgment. Different compositions approach these themes in different ways, creating a literary network rather than one perfectly uniform story. The Dead Sea Scrolls provide physical evidence for this network. Their manuscripts show that several Enochic works were copied in Aramaic and circulated in the ancient Jewish world. The evidence is especially valuable because it places these traditions closer to their early historical setting than the later Ethiopic manuscripts alone could do. But proximity in time does not eliminate uncertainty. A manuscript can be early and still be incomplete. A fragment can preserve an important sentence while leaving the surrounding argument unknown. A collection can reveal that a text circulated without telling us exactly how every reader interpreted it. These limits are part of the historical picture. The ancient landscape also deserves attention. The communities associated with the Dead Sea region lived within an environment of dry hills, rocky terrain, and a body of water whose unusual geography shaped daily life. The physical world around them was not simply a background. People depended on landscapes for movement, food, water, shelter, and communication. The manuscripts were produced within this human environment, not in an abstract world of legends. This grounding matters because it brings the story back to human history. Long before these texts were written, human communities had already spent countless generations adapting to changing landscapes and passing knowledge between generations. By the Second Temple period, writing had become one of the tools through which communities preserved inherited ideas. A manuscript could carry an older story across time, but it could not preserve every version of that story. The Book of Giants demonstrates both the strength and weakness of written memory. Its fragments have carried an ancient tradition across many centuries, yet they have not carried the entire work. The missing passages remind us that every surviving text represents only part of the historical process that produced it. What we can see today is therefore the meeting point between an ancient literary imagination and the physical conditions that allowed a few traces of that imagination to survive. The giants belong to the first world. The fragments belong to the second. Understanding the difference between them is what allows both to be taken seriously. The distinction between a story and the history of the people who told it becomes especially important when the subject is the flood. In the Book of Giants and related Enochic traditions, the approaching flood is not simply a description of weather or geography. It functions within a larger account of judgment, where the actions of the Watchers and the Giants have disturbed the established order. The narrative therefore gives the flood a meaning that reaches beyond the physical event itself. For modern historical study, however, the existence of a literary flood tradition does not by itself establish every detail of the story as a historical event. Flood traditions appear in several ancient cultures, and their similarities and differences have been studied for generations. The Book of Giants belongs to that wider ancient world of storytelling, but it has its own particular connection to the Watchers and Giants. This is another reason the text should not be separated from its literary setting. The ancient writers were not working with the categories of modern archaeology, geology, or evolutionary biology. They were using inherited religious traditions to describe a world in which moral and cosmic order were connected. The giants became part of that structure because their origin was linked with the crossing of boundaries between heavenly beings and humans. Their destruction then became part of the restoration of order. The story does not need to be treated as a biological record for this structure to be historically meaningful. It tells us how an ancient community organized ideas about creation, disorder, responsibility, and judgment. The surviving manuscripts add a second layer because they show that these ideas were not confined to a single later copy. The Aramaic fragments demonstrate that the tradition had already been written and transmitted in the Second Temple period. That evidence allows scholars to study the development of the tradition rather than simply accepting the form in which it survived much later. It also shows why the phrase "left out of Enoch" needs to be handled carefully. The Book of Giants was not necessarily a hidden chapter waiting to be restored to one original book. It was part of a larger literary environment in which different compositions could develop around related traditions. Some were preserved together in certain contexts, others travelled along different paths, still others disappeared. The history of human culture is filled with this kind of uneven survival. A language may survive while some of its literature disappears. A story may remain famous while an older version becomes obscure. A manuscript may survive while thousands of similar copies are lost. The Dead Sea Scrolls are remarkable precisely because they preserve a small portion of what once existed. Their value is not diminished by the missing material. In fact, the missing material teaches us how cautious historical reconstruction must be. When only fragments survive, uncertainty is not an obstacle that can always be overcome. Sometimes uncertainty is the most accurate conclusion available. This principle extends beyond the study of ancient religious texts. Human origins themselves are reconstructed from incomplete evidence. Fossils are fragmentary. Archaeological sites are disturbed. Ancient environments have changed. Organic materials disappear. Many human experiences leave no physical trace at all. The history of our species is therefore not a complete recording of everything that happened. It is a reconstruction based on what survived. The Book of Giants offers a cultural example of the same condition. We can see portions of the story, identify its major themes, and place its manuscripts within an ancient historical setting. We can compare its surviving material with Genesis and other Enochic writings, but we cannot recover every thought of its authors, every reaction of its readers, or every line that once existed. The story remains partly hidden because the past itself is partly hidden. What survives is enough to show that ancient people imagined the giants as part of a world approaching judgment. What disappears leaves us with a quieter question. How many other stories once travelled through human communities, carried for generations, only to vanish before anyone in the present could hear them? The survival of the Book of Giants also changes how we should think about the word lost. A lost ancient book is not necessarily a book that disappeared in a single moment. More often, loss happens gradually, through many small breaks in transmission. A manuscript may be damaged, a copy may become too difficult to read, a community may move elsewhere, a language may change, or readers may simply choose other works to copy. Over enough generations, a tradition that once seemed secure can become nearly invisible. The Book of Giants gives us an unusually clear example because it was not completely lost. Fragments remained, and those fragments are enough to show that a substantial narrative once existed. Yet the surviving pieces are only a portion of what ancient readers could have encountered. This creates an unusual historical situation. We know that something larger once existed, but we cannot see the whole shape of it. The missing material therefore becomes part of the evidence, even though it cannot be reconstructed with certainty. This is different from saying that the missing passages were deliberately removed. There is no surviving evidence establishing that a later authority opened a complete Book of Giants and cut out selected sections. What we actually have is a history of uneven preservation. The same principle applies to the relationship between the Book of Giants and First Enoch. Their traditions overlap, especially around the Watchers, the Giants, and the Judgment before the Flood, but the manuscripts do not support the idea that one was simply a damaged edition of the other. The literary evidence points toward related compositions that developed within a broader Enochic environment. This distinction may seem small, but it changes the entire question. Instead of asking which pages someone removed, we can ask why different branches of an ancient tradition survive differently. That question leads us toward the people who carried these writings across time. A text survives because human beings continue to find a reason to preserve it. Someone copies the words. Someone teaches another person to read them. Someone carries a manuscript to another place. Someone translates it into another language. At each stage, the tradition passes through human hands. The physical manuscript is only one link in that chain. The Dead Sea Scrolls show how fragile that chain could be. Their survival depended partly on the dry environment around the Dead Sea, but their existence also depended on ancient communities that produced and stored the manuscripts in the first place. Without those human actions, there would have been nothing for the caves to preserve. This brings the story back to the deeper history of our species. Human beings have always depended on transmission between generations. Long before writing, knowledge about landscapes, animals, seasons, tools, food, and social relationships had to move from one generation to another. Much of that knowledge was never written down, and most of it cannot now be recovered directly. Writing expanded the reach of memory, but it did not make memory permanent. The Book of Giants survived across centuries because parts of that chain remained intact. Other ancient traditions may have traveled through similar chains and then disappeared. Their absence does not necessarily mean that they were rejected or suppressed. Sometimes the simplest explanation is that fewer copies survived. Sometimes we cannot know the reason. This uncertainty is not a failure of historical research. It is an accurate description of the evidence. The ancient world was larger than the portion preserved for us, and the literary landscape surrounding Enoch was almost certainly richer than the fragments now allow us to see. The Book of Giants gives us a rare glimpse into that lost landscape, not by revealing everything that disappeared, but by proving that the surviving tradition once extended beyond the narrow boundaries of the text that later generations knew best. The question of what later readers inherited becomes even more interesting when we compare the different languages through which Enochic traditions survived. The earliest surviving fragments of the Book of Giants from the Dead Sea region are written in Aramaic, while the complete form of First Enoch that became known much later was preserved in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia. Between those points lies a long history of transmission, in which texts could be copied, translated, adapted, or lost. A translation is never simply another physical copy. It carries an earlier tradition into a new linguistic environment, and the process can preserve meaning while also introducing changes in wording, emphasis, or interpretation. This does not mean that translators freely invented new stories. Ancient translation was often careful and closely connected to the source text, but languages do not correspond perfectly. A word, expression, or sentence structure may carry associations that cannot be reproduced exactly in another language. For historians, this is one reason different witnesses must be compared rather than treated as interchangeable. The Book of Giants presents an especially complicated case, because its survival is fragmentary. Some Aramaic pieces preserve portions of the narrative, while related versions in other languages provide additional evidence for the broader tradition. These witnesses do not form one perfectly preserved manuscript passed unchanged from the ancient world into the present. Instead, they are traces from different stages of transmission. Each trace can help illuminate the others, but each must also be considered within its own historical setting. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls provide something that later manuscripts cannot provide by themselves. They bring us closer to the period when the Book of Giants and related Enochic traditions were circulating in Jewish communities. They show that the tradition was not a late medieval invention and was not created after the disappearance of the ancient Jewish world. Its roots reach back into the Second Temple period. At the same time, an early manuscript does not automatically reveal the original moment when a story was first composed. A scribe can copy an older tradition. A manuscript can therefore be younger than the ideas it contains. This distinction between composition and copying is essential throughout ancient history. A written witness tells us that the text existed by the time of that witness, but it may not tell us exactly when the tradition began. The same problem appears when we try to reconstruct human history from archaeological remains. A stone tool found in a particular layer tells us something about when that object was deposited, but the knowledge behind its production may have developed gradually over much longer periods. Material evidence gives us points in time, while human traditions often extend across those points. The Book of Giants works in a similar way as a cultural artifact. Its surviving fragments provide firm evidence that the story circulated in an ancient setting, while the tradition behind the story may have passed through earlier stages that left no surviving manuscripts. That is why careful scholarship distinguishes what is directly preserved from what is inferred by comparison. We can say that the fragments contain particular names, themes, and episodes. We can compare them with related Enochic texts. We can identify similarities and differences. But we should not fill every missing space with an imagined sentence, simply because it would make the narrative smoother. The gaps are part of the historical reality. They remind us that cultural memory is selective even when nobody intends it to be. Generations inherit fragments of the past and build upon them, while other fragments disappear without leaving a readable trace. In that sense, the Book of Giants is valuable not only for what it tells us about ancient giants, but also for what its own survival tells us about humanity. We are a species that continually creates records of itself, yet almost everything we create eventually becomes vulnerable to time. What reaches the present is not a complete mirror of the past. It is a narrow, surviving reflection, shaped by language, geography, preservation, and the choices of countless generations. The surviving languages also remind us that ancient traditions were never confined to one place for very long. Aramaic served as an important language of Jewish life and literature during the Second Temple period, while Hebrew remained central to Jewish textual culture, and Greek became increasingly important across the Eastern Mediterranean. Later, other languages carried related traditions into different communities. Every movement across language and geography created another opportunity for preservation, but also another possibility of change or disappearance. A story could remain recognizable while its wording changed. A name could be written differently. A passage could survive in one tradition while disappearing from another. For the Book of Giants, these differences are especially important because the surviving evidence is already incomplete. Scholars must compare fragments carefully, considering the language, manuscript condition, literary context, and relationship to other ancient works before deciding what can reasonably be reconstructed. This is a very different process from simply reading a complete modern book from beginning to end. When a manuscript is whole, the reader can follow the author's sequence directly. When only fragments remain, the historian must work with pieces whose original positions and connections may not always be certain. That uncertainty can feel unsatisfying, but it protects the historical record from becoming a modern invention. A missing passage should remain missing when the evidence does not allow it to be restored. The temptation to complete the story is especially strong with the giants because later imagination has expanded the subject far beyond what the ancient fragments securely establish. Popular retellings may describe enormous bodies, hidden civilizations, mysterious races, or secret knowledge as though these details were all preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were not. The manuscripts provide something more limited and, in its own way, more interesting. They show that ancient Jewish writers developed a narrative about the giants within the wider Enochic tradition, that this narrative included named characters and dreams, and that it circulated in written form during the Second Temple period. They also show that the story was not preserved completely. The difference between these statements and later speculation is important. It allows the ancient material to remain strange without turning uncertainty into certainty. The giants can remain extraordinary literary figures without becoming evidence for a forgotten biological population. The missing passages can remain mysterious without being described as proof of censorship. The Dead Sea Scrolls can remain historically valuable without being treated as a hidden library containing every answer about the ancient world. This careful boundary between evidence and imagination is one of the most useful lessons the Book of Giants offers. Human beings have always tried to understand incomplete information. When a landscape is partly hidden, we imagine what lies beyond the hill. When a story breaks off, we wonder how it ended. When an ancient manuscript is damaged, we naturally want to restore the missing words. That impulse is understandable, but history requires another habit, allowing the evidence to remain incomplete when necessary. The earliest history of our own species teaches the same lesson. Much of human evolution is reconstructed from scattered remains rather than continuous records. We know that populations changed, migrated, adapted, and disappeared, but we cannot recover every individual life or every decision made by every community. The past survives through traces. Some traces are strong, others are fragile. The Book of Giants is a cultural trace of this same broader human condition. It preserves a way of imagining the distant past, while its own damaged condition demonstrates how easily human memory can become partial. What remains is enough to study, but not enough to possess the entire story. And perhaps that is why the surviving fragments matter so much. They do not simply open a door onto an ancient legend. They show us how narrow the doorway between the present and the past can be, and how much of human history must remain just beyond what the surviving evidence allows us to see. By this point, the surviving evidence allows a quieter question to emerge. What does the Book of Giants actually tell us about the people who preserved it? The answer is more modest than the stories often built around the giants, but it is also more firmly grounded. The manuscripts tell us that ancient Jewish communities engaged with a rich body of literature about Enoch, the Watchers, the giants, judgment, dreams, and the structure of the world. They show that these traditions were copied and valued in particular settings. They also show that ancient readers did not live inside a single, perfectly uniform religious library. Different writings could exist beside one another, sometimes sharing themes while following separate literary paths. This makes the Dead Sea Scrolls important not because they reveal a secret history hidden behind later religion, but because they allow us to see more clearly how varied ancient Jewish literature could be. The Book of Giants is part of that diversity. Its survival suggests that the story mattered enough to someone, at some time, to be copied and kept. We cannot identify every reader who encountered it, and we should not invent their reactions. But the manuscript itself is evidence of a human act of preservation. Someone prepared a writing surface. Someone copied words. Someone maintained the text long enough for fragments of it to survive. Behind every ancient manuscript stands this quiet chain of human effort. That chain connects the Book of Giants to a much older history of human communication. Long before ink and parchment, people transmitted information through speech, gesture, memory, imitation, and repeated practice. A group could preserve knowledge about a valley, a river crossing, an animal, a tool, or a seasonal change without writing any of it down. Such knowledge could be remarkably durable, but it could also disappear when the people carrying it disappeared or when circumstances changed. Writing altered this process by allowing information to travel beyond the lifetime of one speaker. Yet writing never removed the need for people. A manuscript without readers eventually becomes an object no one can interpret. A language without speakers becomes difficult to understand. A damaged text can survive physically while becoming culturally silent. The Book of Giants passed through this fragile system. Its fragments reached the modern world because material preservation and later scholarly recovery happened to intersect. That does not mean that every ancient tradition was equally fortunate. The literary world surrounding Enoch was almost certainly larger than the portion now available to us. Some works may have been copied many times and still disappeared. Others may have existed only briefly in particular communities. We cannot measure the full scale of this loss because missing texts leave little evidence of themselves. This is one reason historical humility matters. The absence of a manuscript cannot tell us exactly why it disappeared. We can identify some possible mechanisms of loss, but we should not turn possibilities into conclusions. The same care is needed when discussing the giants themselves. The Book of Giants gives us a literary tradition about extraordinary beings connected with the Watchers and the Flood. It does not give us skeletal remains, settlements, tools, or other independent archaeological evidence, demonstrating that such beings existed as a separate human population. The distinction is simple, but it protects both history and the ancient text. A story can be culturally significant without being a scientific report. Its value can lie in what it reveals about the questions, fears, boundaries, and ideas of the people who transmitted it. In this sense, the Book of Giants offers something more enduring than a claim about enormous humans. It gives us a glimpse into how one ancient tradition transformed inherited stories into a larger reflection on disorder, knowledge, and judgment. And because only fragments remain, it also teaches us something about ourselves. Every generation receives only part of what earlier generations once knew. The fragmentary nature of the Book of Giants also changes the meaning of the word knowledge. Modern readers often imagine knowledge as something that can simply be recovered if the right document is found. The history of ancient texts shows otherwise. Finding a manuscript can answer one question while creating several others. A fragment may confirm that a story existed, yet leave its beginning or ending unknown. A name may survive without the sentence that originally explained it. A damaged line may allow more than one reasonable reconstruction. Even when the words are clear, their meaning depends on the cultural world in which they were written. The Book of Giants demonstrates this problem particularly well. The fragments provide direct evidence for an ancient narrative, but they do not preserve the entire narrative. They also cannot tell us exactly how every ancient reader understood the story. This does not make the text unreliable. It simply defines what kind of evidence it is. A manuscript can be strong evidence that a literary tradition existed, without being strong evidence for the literal historical reality of every event described within that tradition. That distinction is especially important when ancient stories concern the distant past. The Book of Giants places its giants within the world before the flood. connecting them with the Watchers and with a period that the narrative presents as fundamentally different from the later human world. Yet the text itself was written and copied much later. There is therefore a large distance between the setting of the story and the historical lives of the people who transmitted it. Ancient authors were capable of writing about remote periods in ways that reflected their own intellectual and religious environment. A story about the distant past can therefore tell us a great deal about the period in which it was written. It can reveal which older traditions remained important, which ideas were being developed, and which themes writers chose to emphasize. The Book of Giants is valuable precisely because it allows us to observe this process. It takes a tradition associated with the Watchers and Giants and develops it into a narrative containing individual characters, dreams, warnings, and the expectation of judgment. The result is not a neutral record of an earlier age. It is a literary interpretation of inherited tradition. That insight connects the text to the larger history of human societies. Communities do not simply preserve the past unchanged. They remember, select, reinterpret, and transmit. A story can remain recognizable while its purpose shifts. A name can survive while its surrounding explanation disappears. A tradition can cross a language boundary and acquire new forms. These changes do not necessarily mean that the original tradition was deliberately falsified. They are part of how cultural memory works. The same pattern can be seen in material culture. A stone tool may be reused by people who no longer know exactly who made it. A building may acquire a new purpose. An old landscape may be remembered under a new name. Objects and stories can outlive the circumstances that produced them. The Book of Giants survived in this kind of altered historical landscape. Its fragments are not simply pieces of an ancient world sitting untouched until modern discovery. They are the remains of a transmission process that passed through multiple generations before reaching us. This makes the text especially useful for thinking about human origins in a broader sense. The biological origins of our species are reconstructed from physical traces, while cultural origins are reconstructed from objects, language, art, settlements, and written records. Neither record is complete. Both require careful comparison and an awareness of uncertainty. The difference is that biological evolution operates through populations and inherited biological variation, while cultural traditions can change within a single generation through learning and communication. The Book of Giants belongs to this second process. It is evidence of cultural evolution, not biological evolution. Its survival shows how an idea can move through generations, acquire new literary form, and remain recognizable even when much of its original context has vanished. What we inherit today is therefore not the whole ancient world, but a carefully limited trace of it, preserved because enough links in the chain remained unbroken for the fragments to reach us. The final question before the story can begin to settle is not simply what the giants were, but why this particular tradition remained worth preserving at all. The surviving fragments suggest that the Book of Giants offered more than a tale about extraordinary beings. It connected the ancient story of the Watchers with questions about knowledge, disorder, responsibility, and judgment. The giants were placed inside a world that had become unstable because boundaries had been crossed, and their dreams introduced knowledge of consequences that had not yet arrived. This gave the narrative a structure in which power did not guarantee understanding. The characters could be strong and still be unable to escape what was coming. That tension may help explain why the tradition could remain meaningful within an ancient literary environment, although the manuscripts do not tell us exactly what individual readers thought about it. We should resist the temptation to assign a single purpose to the text when the evidence does not preserve the voices of its readers. What we can see is that the story belonged to a wider body of literature concerned with the relationship between heaven, humanity, creation, and judgment. It also shows how ancient writers could take an inherited tradition and expand it into a more detailed narrative. This process is deeply familiar in human cultural history. Stories rarely remain completely still. A community receives an older account, retells it, adds explanations, connects it with other traditions, and eventually records one version in writing. Another community may preserve a different version. Over time, several branches can emerge from the same older root. The Book of Giants appears to belong to one such branch of Enochic tradition. Its relationship with First Enoch is therefore important, but the two should not be collapsed into one text. The evidence points toward related compositions that developed within the same broad literary world. This helps us understand the title's question more carefully. What did the Dead Sea Scrolls leave out of Enoch? In the strict historical sense, the answer is not that a complete Book of Giants was once part of a single universal edition of Enoch and was later removed. Rather, the manuscripts reveal that ancient Enochic literature was more diverse than the surviving later form of First Enoch might suggest. The Book of Giants preserves another expression of that tradition, one that later readers would not have encountered simply by opening the complete Ethiopic form of First Enoch. The difference is subtle, but historically important. It replaces a story of secret removal with a history of literary diversity and uneven survival. The fragments also remind us that the ancient world was full of books that never reached us. The writings preserved in the Dead Sea region are exceptional precisely because most ancient literature has not survived in such direct form. For every fragment that can be read today, countless other words may have disappeared through decay, neglect, changing languages, or the ending of the communities that carried them. Human memory is therefore both powerful and fragile. We can preserve an idea for centuries, yet we cannot guarantee that every form of that idea will survive. The Book of Giants stands quietly within this larger pattern. Its giants are part of an ancient religious imagination, while its manuscripts are physical evidence of real people preserving written traditions. Separating those two levels allows the text to retain its mystery without turning uncertainty into fact. It also offers a useful lesson for anyone trying to understand the distant past. The most trustworthy history is not always the history with the most dramatic answer. Sometimes it is the one that carefully marks the boundary between what the evidence shows, what scholars can reasonably infer, and what must remain unknown. The Book of Giants gives us enough to see a lost branch of Enochic literature, but not enough to recover every leaf that once grew from it. And perhaps that incomplete survival is itself the clearest reminder that human history has never been a complete record, only a collection of traces passed quietly from one generation to another. The surviving fragments of the Book of Giants now allow us to return to the central question with greater care. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not simply uncover a forbidden chapter that had been deliberately removed from Enoch. They reveal that the ancient Enochic literary world was wider and more varied than the later surviving form of First Enoch might suggest. This distinction matters because the phrase left out can make the history sound simpler than it really was. Ancient texts did not always exist as fixed books with permanent boundaries. They could circulate separately, share traditions, borrow images and names, and develop along different paths. The Book of Giants appears to belong to this larger network of Enochic literature. Its fragments show a developed narrative centered on the giants, their dreams, their uncertainty, and the judgment approaching their world. Yet the same fragments also show us the limits of what can be known. We have pieces, not the complete work. We can identify important characters and themes, but we cannot restore every missing scene with confidence. We can compare the fragments with other Enochic writings, but we cannot assume that every similarity means the texts once formed a single volume. This careful distinction brings the story closer to the actual history of ancient literature. The people who produced these writings lived in a world where stories about the distant past could be used to think about the present. The Watchers, Giants, and Flood belong to the narrative world of the text, while the manuscripts belong to the historical world of the communities that copied them. Those two worlds meet in the surviving fragments. The result is not a scientific account of human origins nor evidence for a lost race of enormous humans. It is evidence for an ancient literary tradition that imagined extraordinary beings within a larger story about the breakdown and restoration of order. That distinction becomes especially important when the giants are compared with the earliest history of our own species. Human evolution is reconstructed through fossils, genetics, archaeology, and other forms of evidence accumulated across many generations of research. The Book of Giants belongs to a completely different category of evidence. It tells us about what ancient people wrote and preserved, not about a biological population that can be independently identified through archaeology or genetics. Keeping these categories separate does not make the ancient story less interesting. It makes the story more precise. The giants can remain powerful figures within an ancient imagination without being turned into archaeological claims. Their dreams can remain part of a literary narrative without becoming evidence for supernatural prediction. Their destruction can remain part of a theological account without being treated as a documented prehistoric event. This is one of the quiet strengths of historical study. It allows a text to be understood on its own terms while refusing to make it answer questions for which it provides no evidence. The Dead Sea Scrolls are valuable for exactly this reason. They do not give us everything. They give us something better suited to careful study. Fragments that can be placed within a real historical setting. From them, we can see that the Book of Giants circulated in an ancient Jewish environment, that its story was connected to the Enochic tradition, and that its narrative was more developed than the brief references to giants found in earlier biblical material might suggest. We can also see that its later survival was incomplete. The missing sections are not a blank space waiting for imagination to fill them. They are a reminder of how much human culture has disappeared. Every surviving manuscript represents only one thread in a much larger history of reading, copying, forgetting, and remembering. The Book of Giants survived one part of that journey. Other parts remain beyond recovery, waiting not for certainty, but for the evidence that history may still reveal. The history of the Book of Giants also gives us a more careful way to think about what it means for an ancient story to survive. Survival is not the same as preservation in perfect form. A tradition can remain recognizable while losing names, passages, explanations, and entire versions that once existed beside it. The fragments from the Dead Sea region show this clearly. They preserve enough of the Book of Giants to identify its characters and major themes, yet they do not provide a complete account that can answer every question modern readers might ask. What remains is therefore valuable, partly because of what it does not contain. The gaps remind us that ancient history is built from traces, and traces are never identical to the world that produced them. This is especially important when considering the relationship between the Book of Giants and Enoch. The surviving evidence does not require a story in which one complete book was carefully divided and selected pages were secretly removed. Instead, it points toward a broader Enochic tradition containing multiple compositions that could circulate in different forms. Some of these writings survived more successfully than others. Some were translated, some remained in particular communities, some eventually became difficult to transmit. The Book of Giants appears to have followed a path that left fragments in the Dead Sea region and related evidence elsewhere, while its later visibility became much smaller than that of the complete Enochic tradition preserved in Ethiopia. This difference in survival can seem mysterious, but it does not require a hidden explanation. Human societies constantly preserve some cultural materials more successfully than others. A manuscript may survive because someone values it, because another copy is made when the first becomes damaged, or because circumstances happen to protect the physical object. Another work may disappear simply because the chain of copying becomes too short. The process can happen without anyone deciding that a tradition should vanish. In this way, the Book of Giants belongs to a much larger history of human memory. Every generation inherits more cultural information than it can preserve indefinitely. People select what to teach, what to copy, what to translate, and what to leave behind. These choices may be deliberate, but many are also shaped by ordinary circumstances. A community changes language. A school closes. A manuscript is damaged. A reader no longer understands an older expression. A new collection becomes more widely used. Over long periods, these small changes can alter the shape of an entire literary tradition. The same principle can be seen in the history of human origins, although the processes are different. The archaeological record preserves only a portion of the objects once made by human communities. Stone can survive for very long periods, while wood, fibre, skin, food, and other materials often disappear. As a result, the material record is not a complete inventory of human behaviour. It is a selective survival of what happened to remain. Ancient texts work in a similar way. A surviving manuscript does not represent everything people once wrote, just as an archaeological site does not represent everything people once did. The Book of Giants therefore offers two kinds of evidence at once. It tells us about an ancient tradition concerning the giants, and it shows us how fragile cultural memory can be. The first belongs to the content of the story. The second belongs to the history of the manuscript itself. Keeping those levels separate allows us to understand both without confusing them. The giants remain figures within an ancient religious narrative. The fragments remain physical traces created and transmitted by real human communities. Between those two lies the long passage of time, during which countless readers, scribes, languages, and places shaped what eventually reached us. What survives today is not the whole voice of the ancient world, but one quiet portion of it, still audible because enough of that chain remained intact. Perhaps the most valuable thing the Book of Giants leaves us with is not a hidden answer about enormous beings, but a better understanding of how little of the human past can reach the present intact. The fragments preserved near the Dead Sea allow us to hear an ancient tradition that might otherwise have disappeared almost completely. They show that stories connected with Enoch, the Watchers, and the Giants circulated in a Jewish literary world long before later copies preserved other forms of Enochic tradition. They also show that this world was not made from one single book with one fixed shape. Different writings could develop around related ideas, and their paths through history could separate. The Book of Giants followed one of those paths. Some of its words survived, many others did not. That simple fact carries a lesson far beyond this one ancient text. Human beings have always lived between memory and loss. Every generation receives knowledge from those who came before, but no generation receives everything. A child may learn a story from a parent, a student from a teacher, a community from its elders, and a scribe from an older manuscript. Each act of transmission keeps something alive. Yet each generation also lives under different conditions, and some traditions become less familiar, less useful, or simply less likely to be copied. Over centuries, this creates the uneven landscape that historians encounter today. Some voices are preserved clearly, others survive only as fragments. Many disappear without leaving enough evidence for us to know they ever existed. The Book of Giants is valuable because it stands close to that boundary. It is neither completely lost nor completely preserved. Its fragments give us enough to recognize its characters, themes, and connection to the Enochic tradition, while the missing material prevents us from pretending that the ancient story can be recovered in full. That limitation should not be treated as a weakness. It is part of the evidence. A responsible reading does not fill every empty space with a dramatic explanation. It does not turn the giants into archaeological evidence for a forgotten human race. It does not claim that the Dead Sea Scrolls secretly contain answers that ancient manuscripts themselves never provide. Instead, it allows the text to remain what it actually is, an ancient literary witness to the way one community developed and preserved a story about boundaries, disorder, knowledge, and judgment. The distinction between literature and physical evidence also gives us a useful lesson about the origins of humanity. Our species is known through many different kinds of traces, from fossils and genetic evidence to tools, settlements, art, and later writing. No single source contains the complete story. Each reveals something different, and each has limits. A fossil cannot tell us every thought of the person whose body it came from. An ancient manuscript cannot prove that every event described within it happened exactly as written. History becomes clearer when different kinds of evidence are allowed to answer different questions. The Book of Giants can tell us that ancient people preserved a particular tradition. Archaeology can tell us about the material world in which those people lived. Comparative history can show how related stories changed across communities and languages. None of these sources needs to be forced beyond its proper limits. In that careful separation, the ancient story becomes more meaningful, not less. The giants do not need to become literal prehistoric humans for their story to matter. The missing passages do not need to become evidence of censorship for their absence to be fascinating. And the Dead Sea Scrolls do not need to reveal every secret of Enoch to change our understanding of the ancient literary world. They only need to show us one more surviving branch of a tradition that once travelled through human hands. Tonight what remains is a small collection of fragments, a story partly visible through the centuries, and the quiet knowledge that every civilization leaves behind, far less than it once possessed. So how many other human stories are still waiting somewhere beyond the edge of what history has allowed us to remember?